awarding the Osman Hill Medal. So the Primate Society of Great Britain established the Osman Hill Memorial Lectures in 1977 to commemorate the life of the influential anatomist and primatologist Osman Hill, who died in 1975. And we now make a call for nominations for a distinguished primatologist every year, and it's always an extremely difficult choice. This year, I'm delighted to award the Osman Hill Memorial Medal to Professor Kate Hill, who is about to deliver our Osman Hill Memorial Lecture. And before she does, I'm going to, I think, embarrass her with some highlights from the nomination letter we received. This is not the entire letter. But Kate's primatology career began with a PhD at UCL that examined female territoriality and male competition in Cercopithecus diana. And to do that work, she worked in Sierra Leone, where she experienced frustrations of local people who were dealing with some of the problems of living or farming near primates. And that was a defining experience of her research and teaching career at Oxford University, Durham University, and now Oxford Brookes University. So Kate was one of the first people to integrate social sciences into primate conservation. Her research focuses on costs to rural populations of living alongside primates, including protected species, and how this impacts rural livelihood, security, perceptions of risk, and ultimately the relationships between humans and wildlife. Kate's sensitivity and understanding has led her to work closely with local people, and her work highlights the crucial need to consider people's understandings of and beliefs about wildlife when developing effective and locally acceptable mitigation strategies. So while this might seem quite common knowledge now, when Kate began her research, this was not a common area of interest for primatologists or conservationists. And it's thanks to Kate's research, her quiet determination, and her extraordinary influence on our discipline, that it's now very difficult to imagine an undergraduate or an MSc course that doesn't address this topic. Kate's work has more than 2,000 citations, and she, as I said, has been extraordinarily and continues to be extraordinarily influential. She's also extremely supportive. Those of us who have the good fortune to know her know that she's a very supportive colleague. She's supervised countless undergraduates, master's students, and PhD students from across the world. She was key in establishing the award-winning Masters in Primate Conservation at Oxford Brookes University that celebrated its 20th year in 2020. She's mentored numerous postdocs and early career researchers, both in the UK and abroad. Turning to our own society, Kate is a valued member of the society. She served on council for 3 years, and she served an additional 3 years as our membership secretary. She's also been a member of the PSGB Conservation Working Party. So the Osman Hill Memorial Medal is an excellent way to recognise Kate's outstanding contribution to primatology. And I am hoping that she has a medal to show us. Thanks to Alex for getting it sent. There we are. So I don't get the honour of putting this actually into your hand, Kate, but congratulations. And I and everybody are very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Jo, and thank you very much to everyone. I confess I'm actually completely overwhelmed and yes, very embarrassed, but also feel incredibly honoured to be able to do this. So before I disgrace myself by breaking down or something really uncharacteristic, I'm going to start my lecture. And first of all, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. So if you bear with me. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. Okay, so what I wanted to do was to talk a bit about crop foraging behaviour, primate crop foraging behaviour, what we know about it, and then to move into thinking about crop damage and why we might be interested in that, or why I've been interested in it, and to then move on to think about conflict narratives. And hopefully, as I progress through this, you'll see what I mean by these various things. So if I can move on. So the primary reason for many researchers, and certainly it's a case in point for me, the primary reason for many of us to become interested in conflicts about wildlife has been to try and facilitate wildlife conservation. And the idea being that by reducing the impacts of wildlife on people's economic activities and their personal safety, then this would help remove obstacles to people's willingness to share space or tolerate sharing space with wildlife. Consequently, many studies of conflicts about wildlife, including primates, focus on the direct impacts or direct costs of animal presence or behavior on their human neighbors. So the key things here being, in particular in the case of non-human primates, and sometimes livestock losses, damage to property, and fortunately in the case of primates, generally very unusually, human injury or death. Not surprisingly then.
Kate, I'm very, very sorry to interrupt you. Would you like to maximize the slide in your PowerPoint presentation, and then we won't see drafts? I'm sorry to cut into your
all right. Is that better?
Much better. Brilliant.
Sorry about that.
I'll be quiet now.
That's fine. I'm used to it. Okay, so not surprisingly, much of the current research on conflicts about wildlife, and also a lot of the management agendas around conflicts about wildlife, and this includes primates, focuses on what the animals are doing and people's complaints about the animals. And the purpose of this is changing the dynamics of the relationship between people and wildlife in order to facilitate biodiversity conservation. So what I hope to show you today is that this approach certainly provides valuable information to help our understanding of animal dietary and behavioral flexibility that enables these animals to accommodate, at least to a degree, to changing landscapes. And also we can use some of this information in developing effective, humane crop protection tools. But in many instances, this approach actually tells us very little about conflicts about wildlife. And for that, we need to approach the issue from a very different perspective that takes into account social, cultural, and political factors. And it's these areas that many of us are much less comfortable engaging with, and not necessarily well equipped to do so either as researchers or as conservation practitioners. First, though, I want to have a brief word about positionality. Now, what I mean by positionality is an understanding of how one's identity impacts and possibly prejudices one's interpretation of the world. So we're all subject to positionality, and we all have our own individual positionality. But acknowledging and reflecting on one's own positionality is something that is often lacking in training for primatologists, conservation science researchers, and wildlife managers. Yet it's central to social science approaches to understanding the world around us. And most importantly, when we think about positionality, we need to be aware of the fact that it is key to the way in which each of us makes sense of and understands the worlds around us. Thereby, it shapes the questions we ask and the ways in which we ask them. So I'm going to come back to that later. But I just wanted to sort of flag it up at the beginning before I move on to things that are perhaps more familiar for many of us. So, primate crop foraging, as I think is very familiar to most of us now, there are three primate groups in particular that feature very prominently within the primate crop foraging literature: the baboons, the vervets, and the macaques. Though, to be fair, I'm not sure if that's the right word, actually in terms of representation within the literature, chimpanzees are certainly following in a close fourth. Now, the early literature on crop foraging in primates suggested that at least the majority of species that reported doing it were generalist feeders and were predominantly terrestrial in their habits, or at least they regularly traveled on the ground. However, it's increasingly clear that many old and new world primate species, regardless of their nutritional and locomotor specializations, forage on field and tree crops, at least occasionally. So what do we know about primate crop foraging behavior? Well, it's certainly potentially a risky behavior for these animals, where risk is defined as exposure to potentially unfavorable circumstances. And I say it's risky because animals taking part in this activity are at increased risk of being injured or killed by people protecting their crops. And we have documentary evidence of retaliatory killings, including poisonings directed at primates, as well as many other primate species. As wildlife species. So animals engaging in these activities are also likely to experience increased exposure to human and livestock diseases. And again, these may have an impact on these animals' health and well-being. If we look at which animals are engaged in crop foraging, then if one looks across the literature, all age, sex classes have been reported foraging in crops, but the patterns that we observe between sites and also between studies vary. So at some sites, crop foraging appears to be led by adult members of the group, sometimes adult males, sometimes both adult and male and females. Elsewhere, subadults are often the animals recorded as being most likely to engage in this activity. But on balance, female primates with dependent infants appear less likely to enter farms than our other group members, and they're usually the first to leave the farm in response to people's activities. They also show more active vigilance behaviours on farms than do other animals, as we found when studying crop foraging behaviours in baboons in Uganda around the Bonongo Forest Reserve, and some of the work that Graham Wallace and I did quite a while ago now. So why do primates forage on crops? Particularly if this is a risky behaviour. Do they do it because they have to, i.e. because of an inadequate supply of wild foods perhaps, or because perhaps it confers a nutritional or energetic advantage on those that engage in this behaviour? Alternatively or additionally, perhaps primates find crop foods more palatable than wild food alternatives. While the answers to these questions might enhance our understanding of primate foraging decisions and species or populations' likely resilience in the face of continuing expansion of agricultural habitats, this information is also important from a more directly applied or practical perspective, because by identifying the factors that drive crop foraging behaviour at different sites, this may provide us with an opportunity to exploit that information to reduce crop foraging behaviours, thereby helping to reduce crop damage. Now, I don't propose to give a comprehensive review of the available literature here, but I want to use a couple of examples to illustrate how or why this information might be useful. So first of all, thinking about crops as fallback foods. If primates are using crops as fallback foods, so foods whose use is negatively correlated with the availability of preferred foods, then we might expect to see increased use of crops either when natural habitat is lost or severely degraded, or during periods of reduced wild food availability. Indeed, a very common assumption that isn't always tested, but a very common assumption that we see in conservation literature for primates and for other wildlife species is that significant loss of natural habitat is a key, if not the prime driver of crop foraging behaviour. Now, certainly there are examples in the literature where primates appear to shift to foraging on crops during periods of reduced wild food availability. So, for example, Matt McLennan's study of chimpanzee foraging and ranging behaviour in a highly anthropogenic environment in Hoima district, Uganda, and you can see from the pictures here, we've got in the top picture, I don't know if you can see my cursor, here are chimpanzees foraging at the edge of a path and a person walking very close by. The person here appears completely oblivious to the presence of the chimpanzees. But in the lower picture, this is a picture of this general site, Hoima district, and looking at the effects of recent removal of trees in this area. So in Matt's study, what he found was that farmers reported that chimpanzees had started to engage a lot more in crop foraging behavior than they previously had done at this site, and that this increase in use of crop foods had been in the very recent years prior to Matt's arrival at this site. At the same time, we know from external records, there was a very high degree of deforestation of natural forest going on in the area. This is an area where the forests are not under government protection. They are either public land or privately owned small forest patches. But this was an area for various reasons that, and part to do with what was going on economically in Uganda at the time, that there was a very rapid removal, particularly of timber species from this area. And a lot of these species coincide with chimpanzee resources. So it could well be that these animals switched to including crops much more frequently in their diet than they had previously, as a consequence of what was happening in the landscape around them, either through the direct loss of wild foods, or perhaps additionally as a consequence of the disturbance in the forest patches where there were people constantly working with chainsaws. If we look at seasonal patterns of crop foraging behavior, we also see numerous examples of seasonal use of crops associated with seasonal reduction in wild food availability. So, for example, Kim Hocking's work at Bossou in Guinea, she found that chimpanzees increased their use of crop foods during periods of reduced wild food availability. Lisa Norton-Trevors in Kabale in Uganda reported that there was an increase in the use of bananas, cultivated bananas, during periods of reduced fruit availability in the forest. And most recent study, just as an example, it actually should be Findlay and Hill, not Findlay et al., sorry about that, working with baboons and vervet monkeys on a commercial farm in South Africa. They have found that baboons seem to increase their use of crop foods on the farm in response to declining natural vegetation productivity across the season. So these are just some illustrative examples. However, primate crop foraging behavior can't always be explained as a response simply to reduced wild food availability. Other studies have demonstrated that actually non-human primates will increase their use of crop foods related either to crop availability or perhaps some other factors. So for example, work by Gail Campbell-Smith in Sumatra with orangutans there showed that orangutans engaged in more foraging on commercial or cultivated crops when those crops were more widely or more abundantly available, and that it wasn't a response to reduced wild food availability. Similarly, some of the work done on the mountain gorillas around Bwindi Impenetrable National Park has demonstrated that actually gorillas' use of crop foods outside of the national park is not associated or cannot be associated with reduced availability of wild foods. So animals clearly aren't always adopting crops as part of their dietary strategy because of reduced food availability. In some cases, there's something else going on. So what might make crop foods particularly worthwhile in terms of taking risks to acquire them? Well, some of the things, so characteristics of crop foods include the fact that they're highly clumped in time and space. Many of them involve a much reduced handling time for animals when they're foraging and feeding on them as compared with wild foods. Many cultivated crops contain significantly lower levels of non-digestible fiber than do wild foods, and that's part of the selection that has occurred as a consequence of domestication of plants. And also crops tend to be highly predictable in terms of their spatial distribution and also their temporal availability. So whilst there aren't that many studies that have looked directly at crop foraging within the context of whether animals are adopting it as a form of optimizing, there is some evidence from some studies. If we look at some of the work done on baboons in Kenya, comparing groups that foraged on crops and rubbish, human rubbish, as compared with those who had no access to anthropogenic foods, what we see is that those with access to anthropogenic foods showed smaller home ranges. They incorporated more resting time into their activity budgets. They spent less time feeding than their non-anthropogenic food peers. They also experienced shorter interbirth intervals, and there was no evidence of increased mortality in these particular groups, as as has sometimes been suggested there might be. Neither did they show an increased gastrointestinal parasite load. Similarly, work on baboons in Nigeria, Gashaka Gumti National Park, has found that those animals that have access to crop foods demonstrate a higher energy intake and energy balance. They exhibit higher fertility and lower mortality rates, and they appear to have a reduced gastrointestinal parasite load. So there's some evidence in non-human primates that crop foraging behaviors may confer certain kinds of advantages. Animals may be trying to maximize their nutritional sufficiency. They may be trying to maximize energy intake. There are some studies, some work by Erin Riley and colleagues that suggests in some cases they may be trying to minimize the amount of non-digestible fiber within their diets. There may be other factors to this as well. They may be trying to maximize or optimize access to micronutrients as well as macronutrients. But what we can say is that for some animals engaging in crop foraging behaviors, this seems to confer some advantages on them. And we see a lot of very similar data. In fact, it's much more convincing, if you like, amongst elephant studies as well. So this is not just something that's limited to non-human primates. So why be interested in this other than as a way to explore primate behavioral or ecological flexibility in the face of changing habitats? Well, if, for example, primates forage on crops in response to acute reduced food availability, then they will very likely persist in this behavior, even when faced with significant risks whilst doing so. But if they do it because it's more energetically or nutritionally efficient compared with using available wild foods, then this sets up some other ideas for thinking about how we might manage it. So if in the first instance animals do it because they have to, it may well be that any kinds of interventions that might be put in place to try and persuade them not to do this, other than lethal methods, are less likely to be effective. Whereas if the animals are making or sort of using it as an optimizing strategy, but it isn't actually necessary for their survival, then it may be much easier, at least theoretically, to encourage them or persuade them using non-lethal means to actually forage elsewhere and not forage in people's crops. So these are some of the reasons why we might be interested in this kind of information and how we might use it. But perhaps we should think a little bit about the kinds of responses that people have to animals that forage in their crops, particularly responses to non-human primates. And what we see is that crop protection methods fall broadly into two camps, if you like. So active methods such as guarding, hunting, and retribution killing, and passive methods such as use of various kinds of barriers, traps, poisons and visual and olfactory repellents. And the kinds of traditional approaches that we see adopted against non-human primates that are written about in the literature include guarding and chasing animals, sometimes for the help of dogs, but often not, use of scarecrows, use of various kinds of noisemakers to try and scare animals away, but also used to alert other people in other fields that non-human primates are around, and to encourage people to combine together and try and drive the animals out as a cooperative venture. We also see people using slingshots, various different kinds of fencing and barrier methods to try and separate animals from crop foraging opportunities. And also in some cases, we do see people adopting the approach of culling animals, whether it is governmentally or institutionally implemented, or actually groups independently getting together to do this. Oops. What we don't have as yet are systematic, or many systematic analyses of the effectiveness of the different crop protection methods that people use against primates. We also have very few published examples of new developments in how to protect field crops from primate foraging behavior. But here, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but this is a sort of summary of many of the literature that much of the literature that I'm familiar with, where people have mostly tried to evaluate the effectiveness of different kinds of implementations. So examples such as electric fences, these have been used quite effectively in Japan, but the downside of these is that they are costly. They've also been used alongside particular kind of wobbly fence, which also seem to be effective, or at least people think they're effective, or farmers report they're effective. We often see suggestions of using buffer crops within the literature, but I haven't as yet seen any systematic evaluation of the efficacy of buffer crops for non-human primates. I've seen it for elephants, but not for non-human primates. And one of the potential issues of buffer crops is likely to be that in many cases where we're looking at small-scale farms, then the actual land holdings that people have, or the land available to them, is relatively small. And to expect people to put aside, even temporarily, but certainly not permanently, relatively large tracts of their land to buffer crops that may have little food value to them and may not necessarily have much in the way of economic value in terms of creating cash income, is something that is rather questionable in terms of not just acceptability to local people, but actually whether this is an appropriate thing to be proposing in the first place. A variety of other examples, including enrichment planting and diversionary feeding. In some cases, they have been or have been deemed quite effective. In other cases, less so. We have examples of noise deterrence and netting fruit trees. The work by Gail Campbell-Smith, I think, is particularly interesting. She found that farmers in Sumatra, although netting fruit trees could be very effective in terms of reducing the fruit crop losses, farmers weren't willing to engage with this particular system post the study, whether it was something to do with the costs, which weren't inconsiderable in terms of startup costs and logistics, or whether actually there's something else going on there isn't very clear. But she mentions that people are very fearful of orangutans, and that is something that possibly there are some underlying issues there that are separate to the actual issues of losing crops. We then have some examples of taste aversion, and whilst it looks like it's possible to set up taste aversion quite effectively under captive conditions. The challenges seem to be to do with how one actually delivers an appropriate dose to free-ranging animals, an appropriate dose being an effective dose, and also how one targets or makes sure that it's only the target animals that take the baited foods rather than other non-target species as well. And some work a master's student did with me a few years ago, looking at feeding repellents, where we certainly could get a degree of refusal to engage with certain food sources when they were in association with certain olfactory signals. So we used some essential oils, but again, how one would actually deliver that in a wild context is a challenge, but something I think is worth exploring further. However, what I want to do is to tell you a little bit more about some work that Graham Wallace did with me. And this was as part of Graham's PhD study. Again, this is work back in Uganda, around the southern edge of the Dongo forest, working with farmers in this area. And this was a 2-year study to, first of all, understand the interactions between non-human primates and farmers in and around the farms, and then to use that information and work with farmers to develop a series of different tools and strategies to trial systematically in order to determine whether they were effective or not with respect to reducing crop foraging behavior or crop damage by non-human primates. So there are a number of things that are quite important to this study. One, farmers were involved at all stages of the project. So they were actively engaged in the research, including developing the tools and schemes as a way to trial them. And also they were involved in data collection as well to test the efficacy of the different options trialed. So we were looking at a number of different kind of ideas. One, we wanted to think about ways to reduce the energetic returns that animals might get from crop foraging. So we wanted to be able to reduce the time that they spent in the field and reduce their access to fields. So to do that, we were thinking about, with farmers, an early warning system that would help farmers be more proactive or more efficient in their guarding behaviors. And then we looked at different guarding strategies to see if different ways of guarding fields might be more or less effective. What we found was that warning systems, which is basic, it's very hard to see, but in the top picture, you have a red-tailed monkey here sitting on a fence post. Between these fence posts, which are at the farm boundary, there is a net, a fine net with bells, small bells attached. So the animals, the netting wouldn't stop the animals actually entering the field, but in order to enter the field, they disturb the net. And so the farmers can hear where the animals are trying to gain access to the field. And farmers particularly like this because it meant that they could get on with other jobs at the time. They didn't have to be so vigilant, but then they could respond very quickly to attempts at moving into the field. And animals like redtails and blue monkeys that were quite active at this site, actually we had found in the first year that farmers missed between 40 and 50% of crop foraging events by these two species, and that they never detected them even when they were guarding their fields, because of the ways that the animals enter the field. We also found that active guarding was very efficient, both full-time and also part-time with a variable schedule. This reduced animals' access to fields and the time that they spent in the fields. But one of the things here was that it would be very costly for farmers, both in terms of economics, if they employ somebody else to do it, or time, if they do it themselves, because it required people to patrol the boundaries of their fields at very regular intervals, rather than the normal way in which people guarded at this site, whereby guarding counted as presence on the farm, and mostly they were engaged in other farming activities whilst they were there, just occasionally scanning to see what was happening. So the other thing we wanted to do was increase the perception of animals' risk. So again, when guards were patrolling, they didn't just patrol, they had a large stick with them that it wasn't used to hit the animals, and they were never going to catch the animals in the first place. But the stick was used to bang against the poles at the farm boundary. So it made a lot of noise. And also when animals were detected, the guard chased the animal, and they didn't just chase them to the farm boundary, they chased them beyond the farm boundary and back into the forest. We also used barriers. We trialled various different barriers, including living hedges and also a series of different kinds of fences. So at the top, you can see a fence. This is the 3 strands of barbed wire. And actually at the base of the fence, you can't really see it here, but there's ocumen plants growing here. Ocumen, sometimes known as camphor basil. We trialled this in combination with fences. And by the time that the maize is ripe, the camphor basil will actually have grown up at least halfway up those fence posts. What we did find is that fences on their own, if there were 3 strands of barbed wire, they weren't effective against baboons, but 4 strands were, and something to do about the height and I guess the risk of injury. The ocumen, when it was combined with various different kinds of fences, really seemed to enhance the repellent aspect for the animals. They seem to be very wary about passing through it. And it had been suggested to us before we tried it that farmers had locally noticed that many animals, but particularly baboons and other non-human primates, were very reluctant to move through ocumen. It has a very pungent smell. It's used to produce an essential oil. But the other thing about it is it's really good bee forage. So by the time the ocumen hedges had grown partway up the fence posts, not only were they very pungent if you brushed against them, but also they were full of bees. So we don't know if it's the chemical component of the plant or some aspect of that that is aversive to the baboons, or whether it's the presence of bees that are aversive to them. But it was certainly that combination was very effective. Another barrier that we used, as I said, was living hedges. And this was interesting because this was based on observations of both farmers and Graham during the first year that suggested that most animals, but particularly baboons, were very unwilling to move into areas on a farm where their direct sightline of the forest was obscured. And so we used that to partially fence areas. So in this schematic here, this is the forest boundary, and this is a jatropha hedge. So it doesn't enclose the whole area by any means, but what we found was that the area protected, oops, lost my cursor, in here, did not experience any damage from baboons or pigs or other animals, that they avoided this area. Of course, what they then did was they moved into other farms that weren't protected. And this was something that we found all along, that basically crop foraging behavior moved out of the areas where we were trialing these things and moved into unprotected farms. Lastly, we tried a repellent. We used a chili paste on rope, rope fences. It wouldn't provide a physical barrier in terms of animals being able to get over it or through it, but again, they would have to handle it and touch it. And farmers particularly like this one because of the reaction they saw, particularly in Gwenons, for whom the chili paste was obviously painful and unpleasant. But the thing about chili paste is, whilst it is painful and unpleasant and aversive, the effects wear off and it doesn't actually cause any tissue injury. So farmers like that one, but one of the challenges associated with that is that it has to be continually reapplied. And so during the wet season, it's likely to be less popular with many farmers. A year after we finished this project and left, a student from Roehampton, a master's student from Roehampton, then returned to the site independently and reviewed what farmers were still doing in this area, whether they were still using any of these techniques, and whether they still considered them effective or not. And what she reported was that many of the methods were still in use, at least to some degree. A few things people had given up. They weren't paying people to guard their farms. But perhaps most interestingly, what she did observe was that farmers neighboring the original study farms had begun to copy some of the installations that were present on the study farms that we trialed, so that there appeared to be some sense that these were worth trying out at least. Now, I was supposed to go back to this site this summer, or not this summer, sorry, last summer, summer in 2020, to see if 10 years on, how much or whether any of these techniques were still in evidence, or whether farmers had modified them in any way or not. Unfortunately, of course, COVID-19 put paid to that, but so it's something that we don't yet know whether people are still using these or not. But one of the things that we did notice was that although these were effective and people were certainly using them for a number of years and they spoke very highly of them, something that didn't change was people's conflict narratives. So although crop foraging could be reduced, and some people were actively doing that and benefiting from it, that didn't stop people talking about conflict about wildlife. And that is something that is particularly important within the conflict world. So we need to think about how people experience these events and how they think about them and cognize them, how important they are. So we know that people's perceptions of risks are multifaceted and they're changeable, and that they differ both within and between communities and also across different conflict scenarios. The other thing we know about them is that the ways that people talk about or think about these events in terms of perceived risk doesn't always concur with external assessments of risk. So, for example, some work by Amanda Webber and myself has demonstrated that farmers around the Bidongo forest considered at the time when Amanda was working there that baboons and chimpanzees and wild pigs posed a much greater threat to field crops than actually appeared to be the case when we tried to systematically estimate crop damage levels. But what we did see was that they were significantly underestimating the damage caused by guenons, colobus monkeys, and goats. And other studies report similar apparent disparities between what people say or think and what appears to actually happen. The reasons for these apparent disparities between measured and perceived risk aren't necessarily always apparent, but they're likely to be the result of synergies between people's experiences, societal practices, social and cultural norms, and beliefs. We also know that farmers may respond differently to crop losses depending on the value, monetary or otherwise, of individual crops. So again, some work that I've done over the years with Matt McLennan, Karen Heiser, and Amanda Webber in our studies of people-wildlife interactions in both Masindi district and Hoima district in Uganda. What we found is that when we started working at both of these two sites, in my case, when I started in the mid 1990s, and in the others starting around the early 2000s, that when we first started looking at these things, farmers were relatively accepting of chimpanzees. Chimpanzees were thought to cause less damage than other species, and in some cases their presence in fields was even thought to deter baboons who were viewed as extremely negatively at the time and were blamed for much of the crop damage that was going on. Now, the idea was that actually if you had chimpanzees in your field, then you weren't going to get baboons in the field too. People talked about chimpanzees very differently. They characterized them as being a better character than other non-human primate groups. They talked about chimpanzees as walking gently. And what they meant by this was that chimps were only taking what they needed, and that they didn't view chimps as willfully greedy or overly destructive in the way they engaged with crops. When we look at the ways they talked about baboons, then baboons are presented in a very different way. Baboons are seen as malicious, vindictive, greedy, and causing damage just for the sake of it. What we do see, though, is that people gradually became much less tolerant of chimpanzees when chimps began to forage on cash crops, such as sugarcane, jackfruit. And there are several well-documented examples from both these sites of retaliatory killings and some use of lethal crop protection methods directed specifically at these animals. So as circumstances change, so do people's views and willingness to tolerate certain activities. So sticking with Uganda and the work that I've done there, one of the things that has become very clear over the years working on these issues is that farmers' reactions towards wildlife, including their perceptions of them, aren't always driven by the experience of crop damage or other nuisance behaviours, but in fact may actually be linked much more to social tensions or disputes between different interest groups. So this is different groups of humans. So for example, in Uganda, wildlife have previously been referred to as the government's cattle. And this is because wildlife, including primates, were viewed as belonging to the government. However, the government was often referred to, in times when I was doing these studies, as a bad neighbour. And this was because although the government behaved as if it owned wildlife, they didn't behave responsibly according to local people, in that they didn't take responsibility for the actions of wildlife when wildlife moved into people's farms or people's spaces. And one way of understanding this a bit more is to look at what happens when domestic animals, or compare what happens when domestic animals and wild animals cause crop damage. So at the sites I worked at in Uganda, where domestic livestock damages somebody else's crops, then there's a locally accepted system in place whereby if the owner of the offending animal didn't compensate the farmer adequately, then the village council would actually impound the offending animal, sell it, recompense the farmer, and then return any outstanding monies to the original livestock owner. Now, of course, this system breaks down sometimes, and younger and richer people are often accused of not upholding traditional ways and values when or if they don't engage with this particular process. But the important thing here is that there's an expectation of fairness, of being treated fairly, and the acknowledgement of the impacts on the farmer when domestic animals cause damage. But there are no equivalent structures or processes in place when crop damage is caused by wildlife. And this contributes to farmers' sense of outrage, disempowerment, and unfair treatment. And it may even result in narratives of conflict as a protest against, or as a form of resistance to, the imposition of externally mediated conservation agendas. So conflicts about wildlife are multifaceted and complicated. They often involve different stakeholder groups whose beliefs, value systems, priorities, and plans collide. And we should be aware as researchers and as conservationists that we are members of those different interest groups, so that we represent interest groups within these conflicts. We're not outside of these conflicts, we're part of it. So I want to just introduce something called the Levels of Conflict Framework, which is a useful framework for understanding something of the complexities and nuances of conflicts about wildlife, including conflicts about primates. So this conflict framework has its origins in the field of peace building, but it was actually adapted by Francine Madden and Brian McQuinn. I realised I've got the citation wrong. It should be 2014, not 2004. But they adapted this for use with conflicts about wildlife. So the levels of conflict framework works from the premise that there are up to 3 different levels of conflict that can occur within any conflict scenario. And these are referred to as the dispute level of conflict, underlying conflict, and identity-based or deep-rooted conflict. So dispute level conflicts relate to the evident physical appearance of the conflict. So, for example, damage to a farmer's maize crop by foraging baboons. Underlying conflict arises as a result of previously unresolved disputes that may or may not have anything to do with wildlife, but there is a consequence of a previous grievance that went unnoticed or unanswered. So, for example, a previous delay in or failure to receive monetary compensation for livestock losses to lion predation, or perhaps exclusion from decision-making processes about local land use regulations. The third level of conflict, identity-based or deep-rooted conflict, these ensue when an individual or a group feels their sense of self is overlooked, they've been treated without respect, and or denied legitimacy in some way. So, for example, where there's a history of disputes between different ethnic groups that may have historical origins, but that these kinds of long-standing disputes and histories of disputes get brought into current debates or issues that people are coping with. And what we can find quite often is that people are actually using actions about animals as a way of expressing or taking some control associated with these previous disputes. So these identity-based conflicts can be particularly difficult to describe or identify. And as I say, they're often articulated as material disputes in terms of conflicts about wildlife. So these conflicts are a way of expressing something else, something much more deep-rooted. And that certainly in terms of, we go back to the government's cattle analogy in the Ugandan scenario, there's certainly evidence of underlying conflicts there, but there also may well be aspects of identity-based or deep-rooted conflict that actually go back certainly to colonial times, if not before. So what we find in these situations is that even when technical solutions to reduce the impacts of wildlife on people's livelihoods or safety, even when they're implemented and they work, irrespective actually of how effective, affordable, or appropriate they may be, people may either be very reluctant to implement them, or they may implement them, but still use aspects of these narratives of conflict. So these conflict narratives may actually persist, irrespective of whether crop damage or livestock losses continue to occur. And farmers may, in fact, be using these conflict narratives as a strategy for coping with some of the inconvenience and costs of sharing life and space with wildlife. But they may also be using them as a form of resistance, as a way to resist the burden of conservation ideologies and practices that are frequently mismatched with their own priorities, agendas, and sense of justice. So I want to finish, just check the time, okay, by talking about labels and why I think they matter. So it's a final word about terminology. So for those of you who work closely alongside me or who've been taught by me, you will be all too aware about my concerns about the use of particular terms or labels when talking and thinking about conflicts about wildlife. The rest of you may have noticed that I haven't used the terms human-wildlife conflict or human primate conflict, crop raiding, or crop raiders today until now. But yes, I have used them in the past, as evidenced in various papers and presentations. But as my understanding of these conflicts has changed over time, I and other researchers have debated this use of particular terminology or labels at some length. And our main concern with this terminology or mislabeling is that it impacts how we understand and research these relationships. And this links into our issue of positionality as researchers and as practitioners, i.e. how we understand and describe the world as we see it. So for instance, labeling crop foraging as crop raiding or animals that forage on crops as crop raiders brands those foraging animals as the reprobate and the farmers the victims of a hostile, violent and unlawful act. This encourages an emphasis on modifying animals and or farmer behavior as the appropriate approach to working with these conflicts. This has, and it continues to be, the primary approach to these situations with other animal groups as well as primates. Now, this might not be so problematic in situations where conflicts are at the dispute level, with no evidence of underlying or deep-rooted conflicts being involved. But as is increasingly recognized, while human-wildlife or human primate conflicts can be represented as a mismatch between human and wildlife needs, they are usually better understood as a conflict between people about wildlife. And these conflicts arise as a consequence of the different values, beliefs, and power relations that exist between the various interest groups. So failing to identify and address prevailing social conflicts can mean that irrespective of how effective or easily applied technical solutions are in reducing crop losses, these solutions will not necessarily change local conflict narratives or experiences. Nevertheless, the terms raid, raiding, and raider might be appropriate descriptions of farmers' experiences of wildlife crop foraging events. Certainly, farmers do sometimes describe the behavior of wildlife in terms that might suggest they experience these animals' actions or events as intentionally belligerent, vindictive, and destructive. But we should bear in mind that farmers' use of such terms may just as easily reflect the terms they hear researchers, conservationists, and wildlife officers using. And so they may not fully or even partially reflect their experiences of losing crops to primates. So I want to finish there, but I would just like to acknowledge all of the huge number of people that I've worked with over the years who have influenced the way I've thought about these issues and have challenged me and debated with me, and without them, I certainly wouldn't have got to where I am now. So thank you very much. And I shall stop sharing.
Thank you, Kate. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. We have one question in the chat so far. Please post further questions if you have questions for Kate. The one that we have comes from Harmony Klein, and it says, "Dear Kate, thanks a lot for this interesting talk. Do you think that crop foraging can also has the advantage of reducing food competition within a group if food is more spread within the environment, allowing easier access for more individuals, less harassment for the possessor of the food, or other social advantages gained with sharing bigger resources like at Burundi with the jackfruit?"
That's a really interesting question. Given that I tend to work on the human side, I'm probably not the best person to answer that. If I kind of think back to my primatology roots, I think certainly there are opportunities where animals are not hassled when they're foraging. And thinking about when I've watched animals foraging on people's crops, where they appear to be quite calm and relaxed about it, then yes, animals seem to spread out, and I would guess that there is reduced competition between individuals. There may be times when that's less the case, when they're sort of going in for the kind of run and grab option that sometimes baboons do engage in and sometimes chimps do. But again, I think the reluctance of certain animals to, or the apparent reluctance, the fact that they hold back and perhaps related to perceptions of risk, might be that in these more risky environments, certain animals are benefiting from it, but and it may reduce competition outside and with wild foods, but they may be using it more as a sort of just an additional benefit rather than anything else. But it would be great to have somebody study that. Whilst I don't do the animal stuff, I find it really interesting.
Thank you. And we have another couple of comments congratulating you and thanking you. Do we have any more questions? Please do put them into the comments. Alex, I can see you have your hand up.
So yeah, I just wanted to ask the question about potential ways of mitigating the resentment that people may harbour towards primates when they forage on crops in their land. So you mentioned that the view of primates or chimps as the government's cattle, but there are some places which they have applied various compensation schemes, potentially not necessarily directly by the government, but by a local national park. But that still doesn't always resolve the conflict. From what I've seen, there are various issues of who gets more and whose share of the profits or the compensation is fair or not. So I was wondering if you have any kind of additional context for those kind of schemes and any particular insight into which type of scheme might work best to make all the landowners happy to tolerate some occasional crop feeding.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Alex. Thanks. Firstly, there may be aspects of where you've got certain kinds of compensatory benefits being provided. It could be infrastructure, it could even schools, things like that. I think often, as we see within the literature, within the sort of wider community conservation literature and the old literature on ICDPs, integrated conservation and development projects, there is often a lack of association between what gets implemented in terms of compensatory development or events and association with tolerating the animals. It's not that connection is not there for many people. And I think there are many arguments why probably it's an unrealistic expectation to expect people to engage in that way. But there could be other things going on, and actually that would be where I would look first, is that actually really what we're often looking at is that really it isn't what the presence of the animals or what the animals are doing that is the real issue. It's something else, and that actually this is a vehicle for expressing discontent, a sense of being overlooked, disempowered, disenfranchised. For anybody who's familiar with James Scott, Weapons of the Week, which was actually some work done on Malaysian peasants in the 1980s, showing that actually for people who feel that they are politically that they don't have a voice or they don't politically have any power, one approach to dealing with authority is by either resisting or complaining or sort of minor disturbances, not the kinds of activities that will get you put in jail, but enough to be a bit of a nuisance. And it's a fighting back approach. And actually, I'm actually working on a paper about this at the moment with another colleague who works on other conflicts. But I think when we look at this, we need to think about these levels of conflict. And that's why this levels of conflict model and framework is really good for looking at it. And actually some of the more effective ways of managing some of the big conflicts around wildlife. So for example, wolves in Washington State and so on, is actually the processes by which people are working with these things are based on systems and structures developed by the peace building field and the sort of truth and reconciliation approaches as ways of getting people to actually sit down with, interact with and begin to hear what other groups are saying. And as researchers and conservationists, we have to be aware that we are part of this. And we have our own agendas.
Thank you, Kate. I think that last bit might be, well, at least to me, the most important message that you have. We have quite a few questions now coming up. The next one on the list is from Emma Oxley, saying, "Hi, Kate, thank you for your talk and for your advice and knowledge sharing over the years. I have a question about farm selection, thinking about your work with Graham and mitigation measures trials. And the question is about how you chose the farms and what the response of the neighbouring farmers would be. So if you have neighbouring farmers that don't have any measures, they might be even more unhappy when crop foraging, sorry, so well ingrained. when animals come and forage on the crops, and what the effect of that might be on relationships with conservationists and researchers."
Thanks, Amy. That's a great question. You would have to ask that, wouldn't you? The selection of farmers was the farmers selected themselves, as in we asked for volunteers, and anybody who wanted to volunteer their farm was part of the project. And we did have farms that started off with us and for various reasons dropped out during the 2 years, because 2 years is a long time to ask households to engage. So everybody had the opportunity initially to volunteer. Fortunately, from a financial point of view, not everybody did. And then what we did engage with farmers that were neighbouring those that were part of the trials. What we suspect is that farmers around the edges weren't necessarily aware of what was happening. They didn't necessarily see life as being more difficult than usual. There may have been some resentment, but we weren't aware of it, and we were certainly working with them, and everybody was invited to discussion groups and all the project parties, which are really discussion groups, but with beer and meat, which is standard fare, and makes it into both a meeting and a party. So we didn't pick up on any negative aspects to it, and certainly we encouraged farmers to talk to each other, and we did see evidence of people trying to replicate what they saw in some of the study farms, but with local materials rather than some of the materials that we had bought in from town. So things like fencing materials we bought from town rather than use what was available, but people were emulating them. I would love to, if I get the chance, I will go back and find out more about what has happened in the intervening 10, 12 years. But I think that's all I can say about that at the moment.
Thank you, Kate. I do hope you get to go back and soon. The next question on our list is from Russell Hill, saying, "Fantastic talk, Kate, thanks. Given the example of farmers not using netting on fruit trees after the study with orangutans, how important is it, I suspect I know your answer, how important is it to co-design mitigation methods with the farmers?"
Crucial. They should be at the center of the process. It needs to be theirs, and they need to take ownership of it. And actually, our experience suggests that they really do have a pretty good idea of what's going on. They miss things, as we all do, but actually when you pool your information with them and you show them what you've got and they show you what they've got and work together, this really makes a big difference. So some of the things we came up with, they just laughed and went, "No, we're not doing that." And so we didn't bother. But other things that they came up with, it would never have occurred to us. But it's that conversation, and it has to be a slow and repeated conversation, I think, and showing them or working with them in a way that indicates that actually you value their knowledge and their opinion. So it's discussion between equals, and it's a discussion. It's not a here, try this.
Thank you. And Kate, I'm going to jump in and abuse my position as chairing the questions by asking you what you think about who the researchers are and how positionality as researchers affects any hope of equal collaboration with people farming around areas where there are primates.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think actually the approach and the perspective of the researchers is crucial to that, because actually, particularly, I mean, you know, I started off being trained in zoology and psychology. So very much a hypothesis-driven quantitative approach, and that influenced the way I understood the world and I asked research questions. Actually, it was going to Uganda and asking some pretty stupid questions and then reflecting on why they just didn't get the response I anticipated, that made me realize actually I was looking at this all wrong. I needed to rethink. But I don't think this kind of work is for everybody. And I think if it's not your strength, don't do it. Work with somebody for whom it is their strength, because you actually have to really like and enjoy spending time with people and letting go of your own ideas as much as possible and trying to understand their perspective as much as you can. So I think there's a lot to be said for not trying to make us all into experts about everything. And I think a lot of the funding and the expectations on us is that we're going to be brilliant at everything, which is completely unfair and unreasonable. So work in teams where you can, with people with different skills. You'll have a hard enough time trying to understand one another and let go of your own preconceptions and biases and prejudices against quantitative versus qualitative approaches. But actually, even the process of interacting with, negotiating that is helpful in terms of making you more aware of your own positionality. We can't change our positionality, we all have it. It's that thing of being aware of it and understanding how it influences how we work. I think that's, for me, is the way to go. Teams, multi-skilled teams.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Kate. I think we're going to leave it there. We have 1 minute till lunch, but Kate, if you don't mind, there are still questions in the chat, and I think probably still more to come. Some comments and some congratulations too, but comments about elephants who forage on crops growing faster, and baboons too. Question from Ian. Really nice questions about the role of external researchers where there is conflict. Questions about conservation evidence. So please answer as many as you can, but please don't exhaust yourself. But thank you very much for a fantastic talk, and congratulations again on a very well-deserved medal.
Okay, thank you very much. I will endeavour to respond to the comments in the chat.
And as before, the room will stay open over lunch. So if you'd like to, and we'll unmute everybody if you'd like to chat, and otherwise we'll see you back here at 2 o'clock for the next session.
Okay, I just want to say hi quickly. Say silent, but I cannot stay. It's been one of these crazy 2 days where I can barely actually profit from any of the talks. It's so sad. Yeah, no, but it's great. No, it's nice to listen to. Yeah, hopefully we can catch up soon.
I hope so. Well, take care.
Yeah.
Nice to see you, albeit briefly.
I see Kim. I say hello to all the people actually. I
Hi,
see
Tanya.
Vicky.
Hi,
Hey,
Kate.
me, Giuseppe,
Hi. Giuseppe.
and Ian.
Hello,
Sorry.
Tanya.
Hello.
Sorry, I have to go. Wish we could all meet.
Bye. Good luck.
Hi, Tanya. Hope
Hey.
you can hold on
Oh.
to the next semester. Kate,
Hey, Susan.
so many congratulations. Absolutely brilliant. Can I borrow the medal?
Yes. Anytime.
Okay.
Many congratulations.
Yes, I also want to congratulate with you, Kate. Congratulations, very inspiring talk. So yeah, unfortunately, I also have to leave, but well, I'm probably going to see you very, very soon. Anyway,
Yeah,
so congratulations again.
I think. Bye.